Welcome to Storytime with Classics. If you love timeless tales and enchanting stories, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Let's dive into today's classic tale. The White Cat, from the tale by the Comtesse. There was once a king who had 3 sons, all remarkably handsome in their persons, and in their tempers brave and noble. Some wicked courtiers made the king believe that the princes were impatient to wear the crown, and that they were contriving a plot to deprive him of his scepter and his kingdom. The king felt he was growing old, but as he found himself as capable of governing as he had ever been, he had no inclination to resign his power, and therefore, that he might pass the rest of his days peaceably, he determined to employ the princes in such a manner as at once to give each of them the hope of succeeding to the crown, and fill up the time they might otherwise spend in so undutiful a manner. He sent for them to his cabinet, and after conversing with them kindly, he added, "You must be sensible, my dear children, that my great age prevents me from attending so closely as I have hitherto done to state affairs. I fear this may be injurious to my subjects. I therefore desire to place my crown on the head of one of you, but it is no more than just head. In return for such a present, you should procure me some amusement in my retirement, before I leave the capital forever. I cannot help thinking that a little dog that is handsome, faithful, and engaging would be the very thing to make me happy, so that without bestowing a preference on either of you, I declare that he who brings me the most perfect little dog shall be my successor." The princes were much surprised at the fancy of their father to have a little dog, yet they accepted the proposition with pleasure, and accordingly, after taking leave of the king, who presented them with abundance of money and jewels, and appointed that day 12th for their return, they set off on their travels. Before taking leave of each other, however, they took some refreshment together in an old palace about 3 miles out of town, where they agreed to meet in the same place on that day, 12th, and go all together with their presents to court. They also agreed to change their names, that they might be unknown to everyone in their travels. Each took a different road, but it is intended to relate the adventures of only the youngest, who was the handsomest, most amiable, and accomplished prince that had ever been seen. No day passed, as he traveled from town to town, that he did not buy all the handsome dogs that fell in his way. And as soon as he saw one that was handsomer than those he had before, he made a present of the last. 420 servants would have been scarcely sufficient to take care of all the dogs he was continually buying. At length, wandering he knew not whither, he found himself in a forest. Night suddenly came on, and with it a violent storm of thunder, lightning, and rain. To add to his perplexity, he lost his path, and could find no way out of the forest. After he had groped about for a long time, he perceived a light, which made him suppose that he was not far from some house. He accordingly pursued his way towards it, and in a short time found himself at the gates of the most magnificent palace he ever beheld. The door that opened into it was made of gold, covered with sapphire stones, which cast so resplendent a brightness over everything around, that scarcely could the strongest eyesight bear to look at it. This was the light the prince had seen from the forest. The walls of the building were of transparent porcelain, variously colored, and represented the history of all the fairies that had existed from the beginning of the world. The prince, coming back to the golden door, observed a deer's foot fastened to a chain of diamonds. He could not help wondering at the magnificence he beheld, and the security in which the inhabitants seemed to live. "For," said he to himself, "nothing can be easier than for thieves to steal this chain, and as many of the sapphire stones as would make their fortunes." He pulled the chain, and heard a bell, the sound of which was exquisite. In a few moments, the door was opened, but he perceived nothing but 12 hands in the air, each holding a torch. The prince was so astonished that he durst not move a step, when he felt himself gently pushed on by some other hands from behind him. He walked on, in great perplexity, till he entered a vestibule, inlaid with porphyry and lapis stone. There the most melodious voice he had ever heard chanted the following words: "Welcome, prince. No danger, fear, mirth, and love attend you here. You shall break the magic spell that on a beauteous lady fell. "Welcome, Prince. No danger fear. Mirth and love attend you here." The prince now advanced with confidence, wondering what these words could mean. The hands moved him forward towards a large door of coral, which opened of itself to give him admittance into a splendid apartment built of mother of pearl, through which he passed into others so richly adorned with paintings and jewels, and so resplendently lighted with thousands of lamps, girandoles, and lustres, that the prince imagined he must be in an enchanted palace. When he had passed through 60 apartments, all equally splendid, he was stopped by the hands, and a large easy chair advanced of itself towards the chimney. And the hands, which he observed were extremely white and delicate, took off his wet clothes, and supplied their place with the finest linen imaginable, and then added a commodious wrapping gown, embroidered with the brightest gold, and all over enriched with pearls. The hands next brought him an elegant dressing table, and combed his hair so very gently that he scarcely felt their touch. They held before him a beautiful basin filled with perfumes for him to wash his face and hands, and afterwards took off the wrapping gown and dressed him in a suit of clothes of still greater splendor. When his dress was complete, they conducted him to an apartment he had not yet seen, and which also was magnificently furnished. There was in it a table spread for a repast, and everything upon it was of the purest gold adorned with jewels. The prince observed there were 2 covers set, and was wondering who was to be his companion, when his attention was suddenly caught by a small figure not a foot high, which just then entered the room and advanced towards him. It had on a long black veil, and was supported by 2 cats dressed in mourning, and with swords by their sides. They were followed by a numerous retinue of cats, some carrying cages full of rats, and others mousetraps full of mice. The prince was at a loss what to think. The little figure now approached, and throwing aside her veil, he beheld a most beautiful white cat. She seemed young and melancholy, and addressing herself to the prince, she said, "Young prince, you are welcome. Your presence affords me the greatest pleasure." "Madam," replied the prince, "I would fain thank you for your generosity, nor can I help observing that you must be an extraordinary creature to possess with your present form the gift of speech and the magnificent palace I have seen." "All this is very true," answered the beautiful cat, "but, prince, I am not fond of talking, and least of all do I like compliments. Let us therefore sit down to supper." The trunkless hands then placed the dishes on the table, and the prince and white cat seated themselves. The first dish was a pie made of young pigeons, and the next was a fricassee of the fattest mice. The view of the one made the prince almost afraid to taste the other till the white cat, who guessed his thoughts, assured him that there were certain dishes at table in which there was not a morsel of either rat or mouse, which had been dressed on purpose for him. Accordingly, he ate heartily of such as she recommended. When supper was over, the prince perceived that the white cat had a portrait set in gold, hanging to one of her feet. He begged her permission to look at it, when, to his astonishment, he saw the portrait of a handsome young man that exactly resembled himself. He thought there was something very extraordinary in all this. Yet, as the white cat sighed and looked very sorrowful, he did not venture to ask any questions. He conversed with her on different subjects, and found her extremely well versed in everything that was passing in the world. When night was far advanced, the white cat wished him a good night, and he was conducted by the hands to his bedchamber, which was different still from anything he had seen in the palace, being hung with the wings of butterflies, mixed with the most curious feathers. His bed was of gauze, festooned with bunches of the gayest ribbons, and the looking-glasses reached from the floor to the ceiling. The prince was undressed and put into bed by the hands, without speaking a word. He, however, slept little, and in the morning was awaked by a confused noise. The hands took him out of bed and put on him a handsome hunting jacket. He looked into the courtyard and perceived more than 500 cats, busily employed in preparing for the field, for this was a day of festival. Presently, the white cat came to his apartment, and having politely inquired after his health, she invited him to partake of their amusement. The prince willingly accepted, mounted a wooden horse, richly caparisoned, which had been prepared for him, and which he was assured would gallop to admiration. The beautiful white cat mounted a monkey, dressed in a dragoon's bonnet, which made her look so fierce that all the rats and mice ran away in the utmost terror. Everything being ready, the horns sounded, and away they went. No hunting was ever more agreeable. The cats ran faster than the hares and rabbits, and when they caught any, they were hunted in the presence of the white cat, and 1,000 cunning tricks were played. Nor were the birds in safety, for the monkey made nothing of climbing up the trees, with the white cat on his back, to the nest of the young eagles. When the hunting was over, the whole retinue returned to the palace, and the white cat immediately exchanged her dragoon's cap for the veil, and sat down to supper with the prince, who, being very hungry, ate heartily, and afterwards partook with her of the most delicious liqueurs, which being often repeated made him forget that he was to procure a little dog for the old king. He thought no longer of anything but of pleasing the sweet little creature who received him so courteously. Accordingly, every day was spent in new amusements. The prince had almost forgotten his country and relations, and sometimes even regretted that he was not a cat. So great was his affection for his mewing companions. "Alas," said he to the white cat, "how will it afflict me to leave you whom I love so much? Either make yourself a lady, or make me a cat." She smiled at the prince's wish, but made him scarcely any reply. At length the 12th month was nearly expired. The white cat, who knew the very day when the prince was to reach his father's palace, reminded him that he had but 3 days longer to look for a perfect little dog. The prince, astonished at his own forgetfulness, began to afflict himself, when the cat told him not to be so sorrowful, since she would not only provide him with a little dog, but also with a wooden horse, which should convey him safely in less than 12 hours. "Look here," said she, showing him an acorn. "This contains what you desire." The prince put the acorn to his ear, and heard the barking of a little dog. Transported with joy, he thanked the cat 1,000 times, and the next day, bidding her tenderly adieu, he set out on his return. The prince arrived first at the place of rendezvous, and was soon joined by his brothers. They mutually embraced, and began to give an account of their success, when the youngest showed them only a little mongrel curs, telling them he thought it could not fail to please the king from its extraordinary beauty. The brothers trod on each other's toes under the table, as much as to say, "We have not much to fear from this sorry-looking animal." The next day they went together to the palace. The dogs of the 2 elder princes were lying on cushions, and so curiously wrapped around with embroidered quilts that one would scarcely venture to touch them. The youngest produced his cur, dirty all over, and all wondered how the prince could hope to receive a crown for such a present. The king examined the 2 little dogs of the elder princes, and declared he thought them so equally beautiful that he knew not to which. With justice, he could give the preference. They accordingly began to dispute, when the youngest prince, taking his acorn from his pocket, soon ended their contention. For a little dog appeared, which could with ease go through the smallest ring, and was besides a miracle of beauty. The king could not possibly hesitate in declaring his satisfaction. Yet, as he was not more inclined than the year before to part with his crown, he could think of nothing more to his purpose than telling his sons that he was extremely obliged to them for the pains they had taken, and that, since they had succeeded so well, he could not but wish they would make a second attempt. He therefore begged they would take another year for procuring him a piece of cambric, so fine as to be drawn through the eye of a small needle. The 3 princes thought this very hard, yet they set out in obedience to the king's command. The 2 eldest took different roads, and the youngest remounted his wooden horse, and in a short time arrived at the palace of his beloved white cat, who received him with the greatest joy, while the trunkless hands helped him to dismount, and provided him with immediate refreshments. After which the prince gave the white cat an account of the admiration which had been bestowed on the beautiful little dog, and informed her of his father's farther injunction. "Make yourself perfectly easy, dear prince," said she. "I have in my palace some cats that are perfectly clever in making such cambric as the king requires. So you have nothing to do but to give me the pleasure of your company while it is making, and I will procure you all the amusement possible." She accordingly ordered the most curious fireworks to be played off in sight of the window of the apartment in which they were sitting, and nothing but festivity and rejoicing was heard throughout the palace for the prince's return. As the white cat continually gave proofs of an excellent understanding, the prince was by no means tired of her company. She talked with him of state affairs, of theaters, of fashions. In short, she was at a loss on no subject whatever. So that when the prince was alone, he had plenty of amusement in thinking how it could possibly be that a small white cat could be endowed with all the powers of human creatures. The 12th month in this manner again passed insensibly away, but the cat took care to remind the prince of his duty in proper time. "For once, my prince," said she, "I will have the pleasure of equipping you as suits your high rank." When looking into the courtyard, he saw a superb car, ornamented all over with gold, silver, pearls, and diamonds, drawn by 12 horses as white as snow, and harnessed in the most sumptuous trappings. And behind the car, 1,000 guards, richly apparelled, were in waiting to attend on the prince's person. She then presented him with a nut. "You will find in it," said she, "the piece of cambric I promised you. Do not break the shell till you are in the presence of the king your father." Then, to prevent the acknowledgments which the prince was about to offer, she hastily bade him adieu. Nothing could exceed the speed with which the snow-white horses conveyed this fortunate prince to his father's palace, where his brothers had just arrived before him. They embraced each other and demanded an immediate audience of the king, who received them with the greatest kindness. The princes hastened to place at the feet of his majesty the curious present he had required them to procure. The eldest produced a piece of cambric that was so extremely fine that his friends had no doubt of its passing the eye of the needle, which was now delivered to the king, having been kept locked up in the custody of his majesty's treasurer all the time. Every one supposed he would certainly obtain the crown. But when the king tried to draw it through the eye of the needle, it would not pass, though it failed but very little. Then came the second prince, who made as sure of obtaining the crown as his brother had done, but, alas, with no better success, for though his piece of cambric was exquisitely fine, yet it could not be drawn through the eye of the needle. It was now the youngest prince's turn, who accordingly advanced, and opening an elegant little box inlaid with jewels, he took out a walnut and cracked the shell, imagining he should immediately perceive his piece of cambric. But what was his astonishment to see nothing but a filbert! He did not, however, lose his hopes. He cracked the filbert, and it presented him with a cherry stone. The lords of the court, who had assembled to witness this extraordinary trial, could not, any more than the princess's brothers, refrain from laughing, to think he should be so silly as to claim with them the crown on no better pretensions. The prince, however, cracked the cherry stone, which was filled with a kernel. He divided it, and found in the middle a grain of wheat, and in that grain a millet seed. He was now absolutely confounded, and could not help muttering between his teeth, "O white cat, thou hast deceived me." At this instant he felt his hand scratched by the claw of a cat, upon which he again took courage, and opening the grain of millet seed, to the astonishment of all present, he drew forth a piece of cambric 400 yards long, and fine enough to be drawn with perfect ease through the eye of the needle. When the king found he had no pretext left for refusing the crown to his youngest son, he sighed deeply, and it was easy to be seen that he was sorry for the prince's success. "My sons," said he, "it is so gratifying to the heart of a father to receive proofs of his children's love and obedience, that I cannot refuse myself the satisfaction of requiring of you one thing more. You must undertake another expedition, and whichever, by the end of a year, brings me the most beautiful lady, shall marry her and obtain my crown." So they again took leave of the king and of each other, and set out without delay. And in less than 12 hours, our young prince arrived in his splendid car at the palace of his dear white cat. Everything went on as before, till the end of another year. At length, only one day remained of the year, when the white cat thus addressed him: "Tomorrow, my prince, you must present yourself at the palace of your father, and give him a proof of your obedience. It depends only on yourself to conduct thither the most beautiful princess ever yet beheld, for the time has come when the enchantment by which I am bound may be ended. You must cut off my head and tail," continued she, "and throw them into the fire." "I," said the prince hastily, "I cut off your head and tail." "You surely mean to try my affection, which, believe me, beautiful cat, is truly yours." "You mistake me, generous prince," said she. "I do not doubt your regard. But if you wish to see me in any other form than that of a cat, you must consent to do as I desire. Then you will have done me a service I shall never be able sufficiently to repay." The prince's eyes filled with tears as she spoke, yet he considered himself obliged to undertake the dreadful task, and the cat continuing to press him with greater eagerness. With a trembling hand, he drew his sword, cut off her head and tail, and threw them into the fire. No sooner was this done than the most beautiful lady his eyes had ever seen stood before him. And before he had sufficiently recovered from his surprise to speak to her, a long train of attendants, who, at the same moment as their mistress, were changed to their natural shapes, came to offer their congratulations to the queen and inquire her commands. She received them with the greatest kindness. In ordering them to withdraw, she thus addressed the astonished prince. "Do not imagine, dear prince, that I have always been a cat, or that I am of obscure birth. My father was the monarch of 6 kingdoms. He tenderly loved my mother, leaving her always at liberty to follow her own inclinations. Her prevailing passion was to travel, and a short time before my birth, having heard of some fairies who were in possession of the largest gardens filled with the most delicious fruits, she had so strong a desire to eat some of them that she set out for the country in which they lived. She arrived at their abode, which she found to be a magnificent palace, on all sides glittering with gold and precious stones. She knocked a long time at the gates, but no one came, nor could she perceive the least sign that it had any inhabitant. The difficulty, however, did but increase the violence of my mother's longing, for she saw the tops of the trees above the garden walls, loaded with the most luscious fruits. The queen, in despair, ordered her attendants to place tents close to the door of the palace. But having waited 6 weeks, without seeing anyone pass the gates, she fell sick of vexation, and her life was despaired of. One night, as she lay half asleep, she turned herself about, and opening her eyes, perceived a little old woman, very ugly and deformed, seated in the easy-chair by her bedside. "I and my sister fairies," said she, "take it very ill that your majesty should so obstinately persist in getting some of our fruit. But since so precious a life is at stake, we consent to give you as much as you can carry away, provided you will give us in return what we shall ask." "Kind fairy," cried the queen, "I will give you anything I possess, even my very kingdoms, on condition that I eat of your fruit." The old fairy then informed the queen that what they required was that she would give them the child she was going to have as soon as she should be born, adding that every possible care should be taken of her, and that she should become the most accomplished princess. The queen replied that however cruel the condition, she must accept it, since nothing but the fruit could save her life. "In short, dear prince," continued the lady, "my mother instantly got out of bed, was dressed by her attendants, entered the palace, and satisfied her longing. When the queen had eaten her fill, she ordered 4,000 mules to be procured, and loaded with the fruit, which had the virtue of continuing all the year round in a state of perfection. Thus provided, she returned to the king, my father, who with the whole court received her with rejoicings, as it was before imagined she would die of disappointment. All this time the queen said nothing to my father of the promise she had made to give her daughter to the fairies, so that, when the time was come that she expected my birth, she grew very melancholy, till at length, being pressed by the king, she declared to him the truth. Nothing could exceed his affliction when he heard that his only child, when born, was to be given to the fairies. He bore it, however, as well as he could, for fear of adding to my mother's grief, and also believing he should find some means of keeping me in a place of safety, which the fairies would not be able to approach. As soon, therefore, as I was born, he had me conveyed to a tower in the palace, to which there were 20 flights of stairs, and a door to each, of which my father kept the key, so that none came near me without his consent. When the fairies heard of what had been done, they sent first to demand me, and on my father's refusal, they let loose a monstrous dragon, who devoured men, women, and children, and the breath of whose nostrils destroyed everything it came near, so that the trees and plants began to die in great abundance. The grief of the king, at seeing this, could scarcely be equaled, and finding that his whole kingdom would, in a short time be reduced to famine, he consented to give me into their hands. I was accordingly laid in a cradle of mother of pearl, ornamented with gold and jewels, and carried to their palace, when the dragon immediately disappeared. The fairies placed me in a tower of their palace, elegantly furnished, but to which there was no door, so that whoever approached was obliged to come by the windows, which were a great height from the ground. From these I had the liberty of getting out into a delightful garden, in which were baths and every sort of cooling fruit. In this place was I educated by the fairies, who behaved to me with the greatest kindness. My clothes were splendid, and I was instructed in every kind of accomplishment. In short, Prince, if I had never seen anyone but themselves, I should have remained very happy. One of the windows of my tower overlooked a long avenue shaded with trees, so that I had never seen in it a human creature. One day, however, as I was talking at this window with my parrot, I perceived a young gentleman who was listening to our conversation. As I had never seen a man, but in pictures, I was not sorry for the opportunity of gratifying my curiosity. I thought him a very pleasing object, and he at length bowed in the most respectful manner, without daring to speak, for he knew that I was in the palace of the fairies. When it began to grow dark, he went away, and I vainly endeavored to see which road he took. The next morning, as soon as it was light, I again placed myself at the window, and had the pleasure of seeing that the gentleman had returned to the same place. He now spoke to me through a speaking trumpet, and informed me he thought me a most charming lady, and that he should be very unhappy if he did not pass his life in my company. I resolved to find some means of escaping from my tower with the engaging prince I had seen. I was not long in devising a means for the execution of my project. I begged the fairies to bring me a netting needle, a mesh, and some cord, saying I wished to make some nets to amuse myself with catching birds at my window. This they readily complied with, and in a short time I completed a ladder long enough to reach the ground. I now sent my parrot to the prince to beg he would come to his usual place, as I wished to speak with him. He did not fail, and finding the ladder, mounted it, and quickly entered my tower. This at first alarmed me, but the charms of his conversation had restored me to tranquility, when all at once the window opened, and the fairy Violet, mounted on the dragon's back, rushed into the tower. My beloved prince thought of nothing but how to defend me from their fury, for I had had time to relate to him my story previous to this cruel interruption. But their numbers overpowered him, and the fairy Violet had the barbarity to command the dragon to devour my prince before my eyes. In my despair, I would have thrown myself also into the mouth of the horrible monster, but this they took care to prevent, saying my life should be preserved for greater punishment. The fairy then touched me with her wand, and I instantly became a white cat. She next conducted me to this palace, which belonged to my father, and gave me a train of cats for my attendants, together with the 12 hands which waited on your highness. She then informed me of my birth and the death of my parents, and pronounced upon me what she imagined the greatest of maledictions, that I should not be restored to my natural figure till a young prince, the perfect resemblance of him I had lost, should cut off my head and tail. You are that perfect resemblance, and, accordingly, you have ended the enchantment. I need not add that I already love you more than my life. Let us therefore hasten to the palace of the king your father, and obtain his approbation to our marriage. The prince and princess accordingly set out side by side, in a car of still greater splendor than before, and reached the palace just as the 2 brothers had arrived with 2 beautiful princesses. The king, hearing that each of his sons had succeeded in finding what he had required, again began to think of some new expedient to delay the time of his resigning his crown. But when the whole court were with the king assembled to pass judgment, the princess who accompanied the youngest, perceiving his thoughts by his countenance, stepped majestically forward, and thus addressed him. What pity that your majesty, who is so capable of governing, should think of resigning the crown. I am fortunate enough to have 6 kingdoms in my possession. Permit me to bestow 1 on each of the eldest princes, and to enjoy the remaining 4 in the society of the youngest. And may it please your majesty to keep your own kingdom, and make no decision concerning the beauty of 3 princesses, who, without such a proof of your majesty's preference, will no doubt live happily together." The air resounded with the applauses of the assembly. The young prince and princess embraced the king, and next their brothers and sisters. The 3 weddings immediately took place, and the kingdoms were divided as the princess had proposed. Thank you for listening to Storytime with Classics. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more enchanting tales. Don't forget to leave a comment with your favorite classic story. Who knows? It might be the next one we share. See you next time.